The Rebel Capitalist Show. I just listened to a really cool interview that you put up on your YouTube channel. If no one's seen that, make sure you go there and subscribe. It's Alhambra Investments, I think is the name of the channel. And really, really interesting. But one of the main topics of discussion was the unemployment rate. And I think this is really a point of confusion for a lot of average Americans, especially when you got Trump out there, well, before the cerveza sickness, tweeting that basically the economy consists of two things: the unemployment rate and the S&P 500. That's it. But you took it quite a few steps deeper. Do you want to explain kind of your research there?
Well, it all comes down to what, we've talked about, people have talked about for a long time, going back to 2008, the participation problem, which is the labor force is not what it used to be. And there's all sorts of reasons that have been given for it. Economists and central bankers have all stated that, well, as the labor force got shrunk, diminished as a percent of the overall population, that was for various various structural reasons that are not related to macro factors. But yet, when you look at and analyze the labor force behavior, it's so obvious what happened. Now, in a typical recession or business cycle, the labor force itself doesn't really change. And that makes sense. It makes intuitive sense. If you're one of the unfortunate ones who are laid off from, because of a recession, you don't leave the labor force. You don't have a job, but you're still looking for work. And you probably even understand that you might be out of work for months, maybe even a year, but you expect, you intend, you're going to go back to work. And so if you look at the labor force, the trajectory of the labor force throughout all of these recessions in the post-war history, that's what happens. The labor force doesn't break. It doesn't change. It continues to grow. Even through the worst recessions we've experienced, like 1981-82, which was a really bad recession, labor force continued to grow because, again, you don't leave the labor force because of a recession. You just don't.
So when you talk about the labor force participation expanding, are you talking about the percentage or the actual number of people?
Both in absolute terms and the percentage terms, because go back to the 1980s, 1970s, even the 1990s, the participation rate expanded, as did the labor force. But it didn't matter. You go back to the 1950s or even beforehand, the labor force doesn't contract. Now the number of people who have jobs does. That's people get laid off, people get thrown out of work. That's what happens in any kind of cyclical recession. But again, if you're one of those unfortunate few that are laid off, you don't leave the labor force. You realize the situation is bad, and you have to sit out of employment for a while, but you're still looking for work, which is what we define as the labor force. And that all changed in October 2008. For the first time in post-war American economic history, suddenly the labor force begins to contract. Not just the number of people who are working, but the labor force, the people who are saying they're working, that contracted. And what that meant was not only were millions and millions of people being laid off of work, something had changed where their perception was, I've just been laid off and I don't expect to go back anytime soon, so I'm not even going to look for work anymore. That was a substantial change in the behavior of the labor market that is ignored, especially by central bankers, because what happened in October 2008? I mean, the connection, it's obvious. Financial crisis of that level and that depth. I mean, you had companies like McDonald's and Caterpillar going to the Federal Reserve trying to beg it to buy its commercial paper. So, I mean, employees understood that their employers were in deep trouble. This was no normal recession. And so they said, damn, I just got laid off from my job. I don't think I'm going back to work anytime soon. So they gave up on the labor market. And from top to bottom was almost 2 million people. It doesn't sound like a lot when you're talking about 150 million workers, but 2 million people left the labor force, never mind the fact millions more who should have shown up, as population growth continued to contribute to the labor pool, they never came into it. So we had year upon year where the absolute level of the labor force stagnated, even as the number of jobs came back. And that's why the unemployment rate started to fall, was because the denominator, the labor force, was stuck, while the numerator started to climb back up in recovery, or partial recovery. And that's never been fixed. It's never been solved, and that's why the participation rate continues to be a problem.
Okay, so I think the normal pushback would be, well, yeah, Jeff, but it's because of demographics. We've got this big baby boomer generation retiring. So wouldn't that naturally drop the labor force participation rate? That would be number one. Number two would be, it sounds like the labor force participation rate is more of like a survey. So they're asking people if they plan on re-entering, as opposed to something that's more quantitative. And then going back to the Great Depression, how does it compare with the labor force participation then?
Well, taking your last one first, they didn't survey those things back in the Great Depression.
Okay.
You were either in the labor force or you were out. And that's, that was one of the things that drove economists nuts in the 50s and 60s, that decided that they needed to expand their definitions so that we have, underemployed, and we have part marginally attached, and all these different various functions. The second thing you mentioned was, do they survey properly? Well, I mean, the survey is the survey, and if people tell them that they're not looking for work for whatever reason, they don't assign a reason. They don't necessarily assign a reason. It still doesn't matter. We still have under participation. We still have marginally attached people who are not really looking for work, but they would like to work. And then the first thing, baby boomers, that's been debunked, because number one, they didn't all get together in October 2008 and decide we're going to start retiring right now, because that would be the worst time to do it while everybody's 401k. You remember the old joke, your 401ks are all 201ks. The last thing you want to do is retire when the stock market's getting cratered. And the other thing is, the labor force participation rate for people above 55, and especially people above 65, has expanded. It has risen since 2008. So baby boomers are putting off retirement. They're not retiring, and so that's not a problem. What economists have largely said to try to explain the labor force participation problem without blaming central bankers for the global financial crisis, they've come up with something called R star. Now, R star is supposedly a bunch of supply factors that are beyond the control of monetary policy. Things like the labor force itself. Rather than baby boomers retiring, what they're saying is that, okay, Americans who used to work in old factory types jobs, they'll no longer go back to school and learn to code. That's a structural problem that the Federal Reserve can't commit. There's a bunch of people who have discovered heroin and opioids. So the opioid crisis has been used as a means to try to explain why the labor force won't grow. And it's all bunk. I mean, it's just, they're trying to reverse engineer so that you don't go back looking at October 2008 and wonder, and connecting these two dots, global financial crisis, labor force is broken for the first time since the Great Depression. I mean, the two things go intuitively together, but yet, if you're an economist or central banker, the last thing you want to do is connect those two dots.